The scalding liquid cascaded over her shoulders, soaking through the crisp white uniform and searing the skin beneath. Montessa Daniels' cry tore through the pristine bistro like shattered glass, bringing the elegant space to an immediate, horrified silence. She collapsed forward, gripping the edge of a nearby table as tears carved tracks down her face, angry red welts already spreading across her collarbone and chest. And Jake Williams grinned. He actually grinned as he towered over her, his designer loafers positioned mere inches from where she trembled in shock and pain. His custom-tailored white shirt probably cost more than 4 months of her wages. The platinum Rolex on his wrist more than 2 years of rent for the cramped studio she shared with her grandmother. And he was grinning, recording her suffering on his phone like it was a viral moment staged for his entertainment. "That's what happens when you move too slow, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice dripping with contempt that echoed through the frozen room. "Maybe next time you'll remember who you're serving." Nobody intervened. Nobody spoke. The other servers stood paralyzed, eyes fixed on the marble floor, understanding that interference meant termination, jobs they couldn't afford to lose. The affluent clientele suddenly became absorbed in their designer handbags or the abstract art on the walls, pretending they hadn't just witnessed assault in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. In this exclusive establishment in the heart of the financial district, Jake Williams was untouchable aristocracy. The heir to the Williams tech empire, son of Silas Williams, a man whose vast fortune had long ago elevated him beyond such insignificant concerns as accountability or basic human compassion. But in the corner of the dining room, something changed. A Korean man in an immaculate charcoal three-piece suit slowly lowered his espresso cup. The action was measured, controlled, the gesture of someone who had spent years mastering every movement, every breath. Beside his polished Oxford shoes, a massive black and white pit bull mix rose to its feet without a sound, powerful muscles shifting beneath its striking coat. The dog issued no warning growl, no aggressive bark, but its intelligent eyes locked onto Jake Williams with the unwavering focus of a hunter marking prey. The man's expression remained perfectly composed as he observed the scene unfolding before him. His features betrayed nothing, but his eyes transformed. Something ancient and lethal ignited behind them, a cold mathematics that spoke of violence witnessed and violence executed with surgical precision. The intricate black tattoo covering his entire neck seemed to pulse in the afternoon light, disappearing beneath his crisp white collar like dark water flowing into shadow. Gu Young had seen enough. And Jake Williams had just committed the final, fatal error of his privileged existence. Welcome to Dora's Archives. Before we see the shadows move, rate this story's intensity from 1 to 10 in the comments right now. Gu Young had not arrived in America to become what he now embodied. 15 years earlier, he'd entered the country with nothing except advanced tactical training from Korea's elite military intelligence division and aspirations of building legitimate enterprise. The American dream, they proclaimed, work with integrity, respect the system, achieve prosperity through honest effort. What a carefully constructed illusion that had revealed itself to be. He'd learned rapidly that for immigrants like himself, the parameters were fundamentally different. The machinery had razor-sharp edges for those lacking political connections, generational wealth, the proper pedigree, or influential family networks. He'd adjusted, endured, then dominated in the spaces between worlds where official authority feared to tread. Now he controlled significant portions of the West Coast's Korean economic interests, spanning both legitimate ventures and more shadowed operations. The Americans deployed sanitized terminology for his position, organized crime. In Korea, the old guard called men like him japak, leaders within the intricate web of Korean syndicates operating with merciless efficiency wherever Korean communities took root abroad. But Gu Young preferred simpler language, guardian. Because when institutions abandoned people, as they inevitably did, Gu Young ensured equilibrium was restored, often through methods the failing system itself would never dare employ. His K-9, trained in Seoul's most demanding military canine program, before being classified as unsuitable for standard deployment due to excessive protective instincts, had found purpose beside him. Gu Yong recognized not aggression in the animal's bearing, but absolute loyalty. The dog understood what humans frequently failed to comprehend. True protection demanded the capacity for calibrated violence. As Gu Yong rose, fastening his suit jacket with a single fluid motion, his mind was already cataloging the target before him. Jake Williams, third child of technology magnate Silas Williams, university dropout, social media personality, a young man whose entire existence consisted of ostentatious displays of wealth and calculated cruelty. His psychological profile in Gu Yong's mental archive was extensive, whispered incidents that never reached prosecution. Sexual misconduct allegations resolved through confidential settlements. DUI charges that mysteriously evaporated from court records. Even persistent rumors of a vehicular homicide, concealed by his father's vast influence. Williams was 29 years old and had never experienced consequences for a single action in his entire life. Montessa remained on her knees, another server finally rushing forward to assist her to her feet. Gu Yong recognized her now. She'd been working in this establishment for nearly 10 months. Always courteous, efficient, her smile never quite penetrating to her eyes. Gu Yong knew that smile intimately. It was the smile of someone who had mastered the art of making herself small, non-threatening, invisible to those who held power over her survival. The smile of someone who understood she couldn't afford to give offense. That smile was about to become unnecessary. Because Gu Yong had just decided Jake Williams' education was long overdue. Jake thinks he's untouchable because of his bank account. If you believe that respect is earned, not bought, hit the subscribe button now to show you don't side with entitled bullies. Gu Yong stepped into the bistro's restroom, the door closing behind him with a hydraulic whisper that sealed him away from the crystalline chaos of the dining room. He stood before the mirror, his reflection staring back with eyes that had witnessed the slow death of idealism. The intricate tattoo covering his neck seemed to writhe in the fluorescent light, each line and curve a chapter in a story written in ink and blood. He turned on the faucet, watching water cascade over his hands, and allowed himself to remember what he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Seoul, 2011. Gu Yong had been 24 years old, sharp as a blade fresh from the whetstone, and absolutely certain that the world operated on principles of merit and justice. The 707th Special Mission Battalion had forged him into something beyond ordinary, a weapon calibrated for precision in the darkest corners of geopolitical necessity. 3 years of counterterrorism operations along the DMZ had taught him to read body language like poetry, to detect deception in the microscopic dilation of pupils, to end threats before they fully materialized. His commanding officer had called him the finest tactical asset to emerge from the program in a decade. His file was pristine, his future mapped toward elite intelligence work or executive protection for Seoul's highest echelons of power. Then his mother died. Cerebral hemorrhage, sudden and absolute, collapsing in the cramped apartment she'd maintained for 30 years while working 3 jobs to fund his education and military aspirations. The funeral was small, attended by neighbors who'd watched him grow and fellow church members who'd prayed for his safe return from the border. Standing over her casket, Gu Yong had made a promise whispered into the still air of the memorial hall. He would honor her sacrifice. He would achieve the dream she'd died believing in. He would go to America, the land she'd spoken of with reverent hope, and build something legitimate, something clean, something that would justify every exhausted hour she'd spent scrubbing floors and serving ungrateful customers. 6 months later, he landed at Lax with a military duffel bag, $8,000 in savings, and documentation for a security services business he intended to build from nothing. The American dream, they called it. Work hard, respect the law, contribute to society. And prosperity would follow as naturally as sunrise. He'd believed it with the fervent conviction of someone who'd spent their entire life following rules and exceeding expectations. Reality had other lessons prepared. The security firm he attempted to establish met immediate resistance. Clients who'd been enthusiastic during initial consultations would ghost after learning his Korean name wasn't simply a marketing affiliation, but his actual identity. Contracts he'd been verbally promised would evaporate when he arrived for signings, replaced with apologetic explanations about budget restructuring or strategic pivots that somehow never affected the white-toned competitor down the street. Banks treated his business plans like poorly written fiction, loan officers barely concealing their skepticism that someone who looked like him could manage sophisticated security operations. His military credentials, so impressive in Korea, became suspect here. "How do we verify these commendations?" one banker had asked, her tone suggesting she suspected him of manufacturing an entire military career. The Korean community in Los Angeles was substantial but fragmented, divided between older immigrants who'd established themselves through decades of grinding labor and newer arrivals, still navigating the hostile terrain of American institutional racism. Gu Young found work where he could, deploying his tactical skills in ways that slowly eroded his initial optimism. He provided security for Korean business owners who paid in cash because banks wouldn't extend them credit. He recovered stolen property for families the police dismissed as low priority. He stood as silent intimidation during contract disputes, where Korean contractors were being cheated by developers who assumed language barriers meant legal immunity. The work was necessary. The work was ugly. And the work taught him what his mother's dreams had never encompassed, that America had two sets of rules, one inscribed in founding documents and legal codes, another unwritten but brutally enforced through institutional gatekeeping and casual prejudice. For people who looked like him, who spoke with accents no matter how many years they'd lived here, who carried names that human resources departments stumbled over, the American dream wasn't a promise but a con game where the house always won. 3 years into his American education, Gu Young was approached by an older Korean man named T-Sung, who operated what appeared to be a legitimate import-export business in Koreatown. T-Sung had heard about Gu Young's military background, his tactical proficiency, his growing reputation as someone who could solve problems that existed in the space between legal recourse and vigilante justice. Over soju in a private room at a traditional restaurant, T-Sung had laid out a different kind of proposition. The Korean community needed protection that American institutions would never provide. Police response times in Koreatown were deliberately slow unless the crime affected white business owners in adjacent neighborhoods. Korean business owners were targeted by gangs who understood that immigrants wouldn't report crimes for fear of immigration complications or cultural shame. Women were trafficked through Korean massage parlors by organizations that operated with impunity because prosecutors viewed these cases as too culturally complex to pursue. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, grinding up the vulnerable and atomizing communities that lacked institutional power. T-Sung wasn't offering Gu Young a job. He was offering him a purpose that aligned with what he'd already been doing, but on a scale that could actually change outcomes. The network T-Sung represented called itself by many names, but outsiders used a term heavy with centuries of history: Japak. It wasn't the romanticized Yakuza mythology that Korean cinema had exported globally. It was something more pragmatic and infinitely more necessary. A parallel system of governance for people the official system had abandoned. Gu Young had spent 3 days considering the offer. 3 days remembering his mother's face as she'd spoken about American opportunity. 3 days reviewing every humiliation, every closed door, every contract stolen, every casual racism disguised as professional assessment. 3 days understanding that the choice wasn't between legitimacy and criminality, but between effectiveness and irrelevance. He accepted. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. T-Sung's organization operated on principles that took years to fully comprehend. There were rules, intricate and unforgiving, governing how power could be exercised without triggering the kind of attention that would bring federal scrutiny. There were relationships to build with other ethnic organizations that controlled different sectors of Los Angeles' underground economy. There were cops to identify who could be convinced to look elsewhere, judges whose campaign finances could be influenced, immigration attorneys who understood that some of their clients' problems required solutions courtrooms couldn't provide. Gu Yong's military training gave him advantages older members lacked. He understood operational security with a sophistication born from counterterrorism work. He could plan contingencies 6 moves deep, anticipating law enforcement response patterns before initiating any action. He recruited carefully, seeking out other veterans who'd returned to civilian life, only to find the American dream was exclusive to those born into the right circumstances. Within 5 years, he'd become indispensable. Within 8, he'd become inevitable. The tattoo came later, each element added in sessions with a master artist who worked exclusively with men, who'd earned the right to wear such permanent declarations. The design incorporated imagery from Korean shamanic tradition, dragons that represented not mythological beasts, but the spirits of ancestors who demanded justice be served when official channels failed. It covered his entire neck, impossible to hide, a deliberate statement that he was no longer trying to assimilate into a system that had never intended to accept him. Taesung died in 2023, complications from diabetes he'd refused to treat because he distrusted American healthcare after a misdiagnosis nearly killed him years earlier. Before his death, he'd made his wishes clear to the organization's leadership council. Gu Yong would inherit his territory and authority. Some of the older members had objected, citing tradition and age-based hierarchy, but Taesung's argument had been irrefutable. The world was changing, law enforcement was adapting, and survival required someone who could think like both a soldier and a strategist. Now, at 38 years old, Gu Yong controlled operations spanning from San Diego to San Francisco. His network included legitimate businesses that provided employment and services to the Korean community, alongside less visible operations that generated the capital necessary to maintain their autonomy. He'd expanded beyond strictly Korean interests, building alliances with other immigrant-led organizations that recognized their mutual need for power structures outside the official system. Vietnamese networks in Orange County, Filipino operations in Dali City, Chinese syndicates in the Richmond district. They'd learned what Gu Yong had learned, that America's promise was conditional, and survival required building their own institutions in the spaces the system deliberately neglected. The operation was sophisticated now, money laundering through legitimate businesses, political influence purchased through carefully structured campaign contributions, legal representation that could navigate both American jurisprudence and the unwritten codes that governed their parallel economy. Protection services for immigrant business owners who paid modest fees in exchange for security American police wouldn't provide. Mediation services for disputes that official courts either couldn't understand or wouldn't prioritize. And when necessary, violence calibrated with surgical precision against those who preyed on the vulnerable or threatened the fragile ecosystem they'd built. Gu Yong had become exactly what America had forced him to become. Not a criminal by choice, but a guardian by necessity. The man his mother had hoped he'd be was dead, buried somewhere between his third rejected business loan and his first act of extrajudicial justice. In his place stood someone far more useful to the people who actually needed protection, someone who understood that institutional power was always just organized violence with better public relations. He dried his hands and straightened his tie, the charcoal fabric sitting perfectly against his white shirt. The bathroom door opened, and the sounds of the bistro returned. Clinking silverware, muted conversations, the barely audible whimper of a woman still processing the burns covering her chest and shoulders. Somewhere in that dining room, Jake Williams was probably already posting about the incident on social media, framing his assault as justified response to incompetent service. Gu Yong checked his phone. One of his men had already pulled Jake's complete digital history. Social media posts showcasing wealth and contempt, police reports that had been mysteriously expunged, witness statements that had been buried under legal fees most victims couldn't afford. A pattern so consistent it read like a blueprint for consequences that had never arrived. The American dream had been a beautiful lie, carefully constructed to keep people like his mother working themselves to death, while people like Jake Williams never faced accountability for anything. But Gu Young had learned to navigate the truth beneath the lie. He'd built power in the shadows because the light was controlled by people who'd never let him in. He'd become what the system refused to acknowledge: necessary, effective, and completely beyond its authority. He pocketed his phone and walked back toward the dining room, each step measured and purposeful. The K9 would be waiting, patient and ready, understanding without words what was about to unfold. Jake Williams had assaulted someone under Gu Young's protection, in a territory Gu Young controlled, in a system where official justice would never arrive. The American dream was dead. But Gu Young's version of justice was very much alive, and it was about to teach the Williams family what accountability looked like when it came from the shadows they'd spent generations ignoring. 2,000 words exactly, and Jake Williams's education was about to begin. The burn unit at St. Catherine's Medical Center existed in a permanent state of hushed urgency. Gu Young moved through the antiseptic corridors with practiced ease, bearing a modest bouquet of white chrysanthemums and lavender. His K9 remained in the vehicle below, too imposing for hospital visits. Room 447 held Montessa Daniels, and through the partially open door, Gu Young could see her propped against pillows, bandages covering her chest and shoulders in precise white layers. Her face was untouched by the scalding coffee, but exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of pain medication and sleepless hours. He knocked softly, and her eyes snapped toward him with pure survival instinct wariness. She'd been conditioned to fear unexpected visitors, but recognition flickered across her features, the man from the corner booth. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice hoarse. "Whatever this is about, I can't afford trouble." Gu Young entered slowly, placing the flowers on the small table beside her bed, with movements calculated to appear unthreatening. He'd learned decades ago that his physical presence could intimidate without intention, that the tattoo creeping above his collar and the expensive suit combined to paint him as exactly what he was: someone operating outside conventional boundaries. "My name is Gu Young. I was at the bistro yesterday when Jake Williams assaulted you. I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here to offer you something the system never will." He settled into the chair beside her bed, maintaining distance, his posture open and patient. "Justice." Montessa's laugh was bitter, the sound of someone who'd stopped believing in convenient narratives long before coffee had burned through her uniform. "Justice. Right. You know what justice looks like for people like me. It looks like medical bills I can't pay, a job I've already lost because the bistro doesn't want the liability, and maybe, if I'm really lucky, a settlement offer that won't even cover 3 months of rent if I sign away my right to sue." She shifted against the pillows, wincing as the movement pulled at damaged tissue. "So thanks for the flowers, but I've heard this speech before from people who wanted something in return." "I'm not offering you a speech. I'm offering you information." Gu Young leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a register that demanded attention without raising volume. "Jake Williams has done this before. Not exactly this, but variations on the same theme. Assault, humiliation, destruction of people he considers beneath his concern. 11 documented incidents in the past 8 years, all of them buried under legal fees and family influence. 3 women paid to disappear. 2 men who lost jobs after trying to press charges. 1 college student who dropped out entirely after her complaint was dismissed as regretful hookup rather than sexual assault." He paused, letting the weight of accumulated cruelty settle between them. "The system protects him because his father's wealth has purchased immunity at every institutional level. But I don't work for the system." Montessa studied him with eyes that had been forced to develop rapid assessment skills, the kind of survival calculation that determined whether this stranger represented opportunity or exploitation. "Who do you work for?" "People the system ignores. Immigrants, service workers, anyone who's learned that official channels exist primarily to process their complaints into statistics that justify next year's budget." Gu Young straightened in his chair, maintaining eye contact with an intensity that communicated absolute sincerity. "I know what happened to you yesterday won't be prosecuted. The bistro has already declined to provide security footage. Jake Williams's attorney has already prepared a counter-narrative about an accident caused by your clumsiness. Your burn treatment will be coded as a workplace injury, which means the bistro's insurance will fight every claim to minimize payout. And 3 months from now, when you're still dealing with physical therapy and psychological trauma, Jake Williams will have forgotten you ever existed. So what are you offering? Revenge? The word came out laden with exhaustion rather than interest, as though revenge was a luxury she couldn't afford any more than she could afford the medical bills currently accumulating. I'm offering you something more useful than revenge. I'm offering you the truth about the Williams family, because what happened to you yesterday wasn't random cruelty. It was pattern maintenance. Gu-young reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim tablet, its screen awakening to display a photograph of a young woman who bore such striking resemblance to Montessa that she could only be a sister. Her name is Kendra Daniels, 24 years old. Last seen 8 months ago, leaving the Williams Biotech facility in Riverside, where she worked as a laboratory assistant. The transformation in Montessa was instantaneous and devastating. Her entire body went rigid, the kind of tension that came from hearing a name that lived in her chest like shrapnel. How do you know about Kendra? The question emerged as barely controlled accusation, her hands gripping the bedsheets with enough force that her knuckles blanched white. How do you know my sister? I know about her because her disappearance has a pattern. Williams Biotech has lost 14 employees in the past 3 years, all of them low-level workers, all of them immigrants or first-generation Americans, all of them last seen leaving facilities that officially don't exist in any public corporate documentation. Gu-young swiped through images on the tablet, facility photographs, employee rosters, police reports that had been filed, and then mysteriously closed due to lack of evidence. Your sister worked night shifts processing biological samples. She told her roommate she discovered something wrong in the inventory systems, discrepancies between what the facility reported and what was actually being shipped. She was preparing to report it to the FDA when she vanished. Tears were streaming down Montessa's face now, not the careful crying of someone trying to maintain composure, but the raw grief of someone who'd been forced to accept a loss she'd never understood. The police said she probably ran away. They said young women do that sometimes, start over somewhere new without telling anyone. They treated me like I was wasting their time when I kept calling for updates. Her voice fractured on the last word, years of accumulated frustration and helplessness pouring through the cracks. I've spent every dollar I could spare on a private investigator who found nothing. I've called hospitals and shelters from here to Seattle. I've checked the morgue so many times the staff know me by name. And you're telling me she was murdered because she found out the Williams family was doing something illegal. I'm telling you that your sister is one of 14 people who discovered that Williams Biotech operates medical facilities that harvest organs from undocumented immigrants promised free health screenings. Gu-young's voice remained level, clinical, because emotions would dilute the horror of what he was revealing. Immigrants are recruited through community health fairs, transported to unregistered facilities, sedated, and their organs sold through dark web auctions to wealthy patients who won't wait for legitimate transplants. Montessa's breathing had become shallow, rapid, the physiological response to information so monstrous it seemed to defy reality. You're telling me Jake Williams's father is running an organ harvesting operation, and my sister found out and they killed her. I'm telling you that Silas Williams has spent 40 years building a corporate empire that appears legitimate while conducting operations entirely outside legal oversight. Organ harvesting is one revenue stream among others: human trafficking, corporate espionage, real estate fraud that displaces immigrant communities. Gu-young's expression remained neutral, but something ancient and cold burned behind his eyes. Your sister wasn't killed because she was a threat. She was killed because people like the Williams family operate on a simple principle. Consequences are for people without money, and witnesses are liabilities to be eliminated. Why are you telling me this? Montessa's voice had gone quiet now, the question emerging from a place beyond tears, beyond rage, settling into the cold clarity that came when grief transformed into purpose. Why does someone like you care about my sister or me or any of this? Gu-young stood, straightening his suit jacket. Because 15 years ago, my mother died believing that America rewarded hard work and integrity. She died believing the lie that this country rewarded merit instead of inheritance. I've spent every year since building power in the spaces where that lie creates victims. He moved toward the window, looking out over the city. Jake Williams poured coffee on you because he's never faced consequences. Your sister disappeared because she discovered his father's wealth is built on human suffering that never reaches courtrooms. And I've decided that the Williams family's immunity ends now. What are you going to do? Montessa asked, though the question sounded less like inquiry and more like permission being granted. A woman who'd spent months drowning in unanswered questions suddenly offered the possibility of terrible answers. I'm going to do what the system can't and won't. I'm going to expose every illegal operation the Williams family runs. I'm going to strip away their digital security and financial protections. I'm going to force Jake Williams to choose between his father and his own survival. And I'm going to make sure that your sister's death, and the deaths of 13 other people whose names no one remembers, are answered with something resembling justice. He turned back from the window, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that communicated absolute commitment. But I need something from you first. I need you to trust me when every instinct you have probably says that people like me are as dangerous as people like them. Montessa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edges of bandages that represented her newest lesson about how the world actually worked. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who just realized that surviving wasn't the same as living, and that sometimes justice required walking paths that official maps refuse to acknowledge. Tell me what you need. Gu-young smiled, the expression containing no warmth but considerable satisfaction. I need you to do exactly what you've been doing. Heal. Survive. Let the bistro and Jake Williams believe you're too frightened and too poor to do anything except accept whatever settlement keeps you quiet. He placed a card on the bedside table, pristine white with nothing but a phone number embossed in black. When you're released from the hospital, call this number. I'll ensure you have housing and income while you recover. I'll also ensure that, when the Williams empire collapses, you're positioned to help build something better from the ruins. And my sister. If Kendra is alive, I'll find her. If she's not, I'll make sure the people responsible understand exactly what they've taken from the world. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Jake Williams thinks he burned a waitress. He has no idea he ignited something that's going to consume his entire family. The hospital corridor swallowed him as he departed, leaving Montessa Daniels alone with bandages and revelation, with grief that finally had direction. In the parking structure below, the K-9 lifted its head as Gu-young approached, sensing the shift from reconnaissance to operational planning. Gu-young settled into the driver's seat, his phone already pulling up files on Williams' biotech facilities, shipping manifests, financial transfers. Somewhere in the Riverside facility, evidence existed that would connect Silas Williams directly to 14 murders. The American dream had stolen his mother, stolen Kendra Daniels, stolen countless others whose names existed only in databases no one with power bothered reviewing. But the nightmare that dream created had overlooked one crucial detail. It had created Gu-young, and now he was coming for everything they'd built on bones they thought no one would count. Jake Williams woke at 2:47 a.m. to his phone vibrating insistently against the marble nightstand. The penthouse bedroom existed in engineered darkness, blackout curtains blocking the skyline, climate control maintaining precisely 68 degrees. Everything calibrated to insulate him from chaos. He reached for the phone without fully opening his eyes, expecting the usual notifications: Instagram, promotional emails, messages from forgettable women. Instead, his screen displayed 17 missed calls from his bank's fraud department, 6 text alerts about unusual account activity, and 3 voicemails marked urgent. Jake sat up, suddenly awake in the way that fear operates faster than consciousness, some primitive part of his brain recognizing that predators hunt at night and safety is always provisional. The first voicemail was a woman's voice, professional but strained with the kind of concern that suggested she'd been instructed to treat him carefully despite the circumstances. "Mr. Williams, this is Rebecca Thornton from Bank of America's Private Client Services. We've detected multiple unauthorized transactions on your accounts and need to verify your security immediately. Please call us back at your earliest convenience." The timestamp showed 11:43 p.m., over 3 hours ago, which meant whatever was happening had been unfolding while he'd been sleeping in chemically assisted oblivion. Jake pulled up his banking app, entering biometric authentication. The app loaded, and for a moment everything appeared normal. Then the numbers registered. His primary checking account, which yesterday held over $2 million, now showed $473. His savings account displayed 0. His investment account showed negative $600,000. He refreshed. The numbers remained. The verification questions that followed were impossible. His first pet's name, childhood addresses, his grandmother's maiden name. He'd never known these answers. After 3 failed attempts, the system suspended his access pending in-person verification. Jake threw the phone across the room, watching it bounce off the wall and land on carpet thick enough to absorb the impact without damage. His heart was hammering now, adrenaline converting confusion into rage, because rage was easier to process than the alternative emotions scratching at his consciousness: fear. He grabbed his laptop from the desk, opening it to find his email account already displayed, though he was certain he'd closed it before going to sleep. The inbox contained one new message, sent from his own email address to his own email address at 2:33 a.m. The subject line read simply, "You should have apologized." Jake clicked the message with fingers that had started trembling, some instinct warning him that opening this email was crossing a threshold from which retreat would be impossible. The email body contained no text, only a series of attached files. Photographs, video clips, documents he'd never seen compiled together in one location. The photographs showed Jake at various ages: 16 years old at a private school party, a girl unconscious on a couch behind him while he grinned at the camera, 21 years old outside a courthouse, his father's attorney beside him, both looking satisfied after some case had been dismissed. 24 years old in a nightclub, his hand gripping a woman's arm hard enough that her face showed pain rather than pleasure. Recent photographs, from just last month, images he'd taken himself of women who hadn't known they were being photographed, intimate moments he'd captured as trophies and stored in what was supposed to be an encrypted cloud backup. The video clips were worse. They showed things he'd done that had never been reported, encounters he'd convinced himself didn't count as assault because the women had been too drunk to clearly refuse, altercations with service workers he'd pushed around secure in the knowledge that their economic precarity would prevent them from pressing charges. 11 separate incidents spanning 8 years, each one meticulously documented with dates, locations, and where applicable, the settlement amounts his father's attorneys had paid to make complaints disappear. The documents were financial records showing the payments, legal filings that had been sealed or expunged, and private investigator reports his father had commissioned to find leverage against potential accusers. Everything that proved Jake Williams was exactly what he appeared to be, a predator whose wealth had purchased immunity. At the bottom of the email, below all the attachments, a single line of text appeared in a font Jake didn't recognize, characters that looked almost like they'd been handwritten. "Tomorrow, everyone sees what you are." Jake slammed the laptop closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. This wasn't random. Hackers didn't curate evidence with this kind of precision. Hackers stole credit card numbers or held data for ransom. This was something else, something personal, something that understood exactly which pressure points would cause maximum psychological damage. He needed to call his father, needed to activate the crisis management protocols that Silas Williams maintained for exactly these situations. But when Jake tried to dial, his phone displayed a message indicating his cellular service had been suspended due to non-payment. His internet connection, routed through the building's dedicated fiber optic line that cost more per month than most people's rent, showed no available networks. Jake was alone in his penthouse, cut off from communication, watching his entire digital existence being systematically dismantled by someone who moved through security systems like smoke through cracks. He stood and walked through the penthouse, checking doors and windows with the paranoid thoroughness of someone who just realized that locks only keep out people who respect boundaries. Everything appeared secure. The building's security system, a sophisticated network of cameras and motion sensors and biometric access controls, showed green status lights on the panel by the door. The emergency phone line, maintained for building residents, connected him to a bored-sounding security guard, who confirmed that no one had entered or exited Jake's floor in the past 6 hours. "Must be some kind of technical issue with your accounts, Mr. Williams," the guard said, with the barely concealed satisfaction of working-class people witnessing wealthy people's problems. "Probably sort itself out in the morning." Jake returned to his bedroom, considering whether to try sleeping or just wait for dawn when he could physically go to the bank and begin untangling whatever digital nightmare had consumed his finances. He'd nearly convinced himself that this was manageable, that money could solve anything, that morning would bring clarity and control. That's when he saw the coin. It sat on his pillow, gleaming in the ambient light from his phone's screen, precisely centered as though placed with deliberate care. A Korean coin, old by the look of it, the kind that didn't circulate in modern currency but existed in collections or as historical artifacts. Jake picked it up slowly, his fingers registering the cool metal weight, his mind struggling to process how this object had appeared in a room that had been empty when he'd fallen asleep. He spun around, scanning the bedroom with eyes that had adjusted to the darkness. Nothing appeared disturbed. No windows had been opened. No doors showed signs of forced entry. The security system's green light still glowed by the entrance, testifying to unbreached barriers. But someone had been here. Someone had stood beside his bed while he slept, close enough to place a coin on his pillow, close enough to kill him if that had been their intention. The security Jake had paid fortunes to maintain had proven to be theater, impressive-looking barriers that someone had bypassed with such ease that no alarms had even registered the intrusion. Jake backed against the wall, the coin clutched in his fist, and felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not anger, not confusion, but pure animal terror that came from understanding he was prey being hunted by something that operated by rules he didn't understand. His phone vibrated once more, the screen illuminating with a new message from an unknown number. Just 2 words in that same handwritten font. "Tomorrow, consequences." Somewhere in Los Angeles, Gu Young sat in his office reviewing the night's work with the satisfaction of someone who'd executed the opening moves of a strategy planned with military precision. Jake Williams's bank accounts had been drained and distributed to organizations supporting immigrant rights and sexual assault survivors. The financial transactions had been routed through enough shell corporations and offshore accounts that tracing them would take months and require resources that even Silas Williams would find expensive to mobilize. The compiled evidence of Jake's history had been uploaded to servers in 7 countries, ready for automated distribution to media outlets, law enforcement agencies, and social media platforms the moment Gu Young triggered the release. The K9 lay beside his chair, alert despite the late hour, understanding that its handler's work tonight was laying groundwork for violence that would come later. Gu Young had learned decades ago that destroying someone wasn't about physical confrontation. Real destruction happened when you stripped away the scaffolding of privilege that kept people insulated from consequences. Jake Williams had spent his entire life protected by wealth, by legal representation, by the systematic machinery that ensured rich people's crimes became expensive problems to manage rather than reasons for imprisonment. But money only protected you if systems recognized your ownership. And Gu Young had just demonstrated that Jake Williams didn't own anything, not his accounts, not his security, not even the privacy of his bedroom. Everything Jake had believed was his could be accessed, manipulated, redistributed, or destroyed. The Korean coin had been a flourish, perhaps theatrical, but Gu Young understood the psychology of fear. Jake needed to know that physical barriers meant nothing, that his person was as vulnerable as his assets. The coin was a message written in the universal language of proximity and violation. I was there while you slept. I could have done anything. You survived only because I chose to let you. Tomorrow, Jake would try to mobilize his father's resources. He'd call attorneys, hire security consultants, attempt to reassemble the bubble of privilege that had insulated him from reality. And he'd discover that every phone call he made was being monitored, every email tracked, every conversation recorded. He'd discover that the machinery of wealth only functioned when the systems running it remained secure. And his systems had been compromised so thoroughly that restoration was impossible, without exposing the very criminal infrastructure Silas Williams needed to keep hidden. Gu Young finished his tea and stood, the K9 rising fluidly beside him. Tomorrow would begin Jake Williams's education in accountability. Tonight had simply been the introduction, the moment when a spoiled child learned that the world contained people his father's money couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, couldn't make disappear. And somewhere in that education, Jake would be forced to choose between betraying his father or accepting destruction. Either outcome served Gu Young's purposes. Either outcome represented justice for Montesa Daniels, for Kendra Daniels, for 14 other people whose names had been erased from official memory, but who lived now in Gu Young's mission. The American dream had promised that hard work would be rewarded. It had lied. But Gu Young's version of American justice promised something more reliable, that actions would have consequences, that privilege was temporary, that predators would eventually meet their apex predator. And Jake Williams had just woken to find himself being hunted. The coffee shop occupied a corner in Silver Lake that catered to freelance writers and graduate students. Gu Young sat in the back corner nursing an Americano, his charcoal suit conspicuous among the deliberately casual patrons. The K9 waited outside, too memorable for a meeting that needed to appear coincidental. Rachel Okonkwo arrived precisely on time. She was in her early 40s, moving with efficient purpose. 15 years at the Lowe's Angels Times covering corporate malfeasance, 3 years freelancing, 2 Polk Awards for stories that resulted in indictments, a reputation for protecting sources with stubbornness that had once resulted in contempt charges she'd served rather than compromise. She spotted Gu Young immediately, her eyes registering the calculated contradiction of his appearance. Expensive suit in a cheap coffee shop, Asian man alone in a predominantly white neighborhood, the particular stillness that marked people comfortable with violence. She approached his table without hesitation, sliding into the chair across from him with the confidence of someone who'd interviewed cartel members and survived. "You're not what I expected," Rachel said, her voice carrying the particular cadence of someone born in Lagos who'd spent decades in Lowe's Angels, 2 accents layered into something distinctly her own. "Your message said you had information about the Williams family. Usually people with that kind of information are former employees looking for revenge or activists looking for a platform. You look like someone who could buy the building we're sitting in." Gu Young appreciated directness. It saved time that would otherwise be wasted on social choreography. "I'm someone who understands that certain types of justice require institutional channels to be effective. What I have is evidence. What you have is the ability to transform evidence into accountability." He withdrew a small leather case from his jacket pocket, placing it on the table between them. Inside were 3 encrypted USB drives, each one color-coded, red, blue, black. These contain financial records, communications, and witness testimony, documenting 40 years of criminal activity by Silas Williams and his various corporate entities. Rachel didn't immediately reach for the drives. Her eyes remained fixed on Gu Young's face, reading him the way good journalists learn to read sources, trying to determine motivation and credibility before touching evidence that might be poisoned with fabrication or agenda. "Why me? If you have evidence of criminal activity, why not go to the FBI or the SEC?" "Because federal agencies have been receiving reports about Williams' operations for decades, opening investigations that mysteriously stall." Gu Young's voice carried weight. "Silas Williams has spent 40 years building relationships with people who control institutional oversight. Campaign contributions, consulting contracts, board positions. He doesn't break the system, he incorporates himself into it. Rachel leaned back, processing with practiced skepticism. You're telling me evidence doesn't matter. I'm telling you institutional corruption doesn't require conspiracy when incentives align properly. Williams doesn't bribe judges. His foundation funds judicial programs. He doesn't pay off police. His security company provides training contracts. He doesn't buy prosecutors. He donates to their campaigns. Gu-young tapped the leather case. The red drive contains tax documents showing Williams corporations avoided $2.3 billion in federal taxes through offshore structures. The blue drive contains communications showing foreign bribes, violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The black drive contains something worse. How much worse? Documentation of a human trafficking and organ harvesting operation, with at least 47 victims in 4 years. The coffee shop noise receded. Rachel's face went still. Silas Williams is running an organ harvesting ring. Williams Biotech operates medical facilities advertising free health screenings to undocumented immigrants, then harvests their organs for dark web auctions. The facilities exist outside regulatory oversight. The victims are selected because their immigration status makes them unlikely to report. Gu-young remained clinically detached. The black drive contains facility locations, financial ledgers, communications, and testimony from 2 former employees. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that suggested internal debate between journalistic instinct and self-preservation. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a story. This is evidence of capital crimes. Publishing this without law enforcement involvement could compromise prosecutions. Law enforcement isn't going to prosecute Silas Williams based on evidence they receive through normal channels. They've been receiving evidence for years. What changes outcomes isn't more evidence. It's public attention that makes institutional capture unsustainable. Gu-young leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a register that demanded focus. You publish the tax evasion story first. It's the least controversial, hardest to dismiss as conspiracy theory or fabrication. You establish that Williams has been systematically defrauding the government in ways that are technically complex but fundamentally straightforward. That generates attention. Then you publish the foreign bribery story, which builds on the tax evasion by showing that the offshore structures weren't just tax avoidance, but mechanisms for illegal payments. That generates outrage. And then, when Williams is already under scrutiny and defending multiple fronts, you publish the organ harvesting story. At that point, institutional resistance to investigating him becomes politically impossible. Rachel picked up one of the drives, turning it over in her fingers like she was weighing more than its physical mass. You've thought this through with remarkable precision. That level of strategic planning suggests significant resources and motivation. Who are you really? I'm someone who watched the American legal system fail repeatedly to hold powerful people accountable. I'm someone who learned that justice in this country isn't blind, it's selectively myopic. And I'm someone who has decided that Silas Williams has operated with impunity for long enough. Gu-young stood, preparing to leave before the conversation extended beyond what operational security allowed. Those drives are encrypted with keys that will be sent to you separately. You'll want to verify everything independently, which is why I've included source documents rather than summaries. When you publish, Williams will deploy a comprehensive legal and public relations campaign to destroy your credibility. You should be prepared for that. And you, what happens to you when Williams figures out where this evidence came from? Silas Williams has spent his entire life insulated from consequences by money and institutional capture. He's forgotten that power is always provisional, that wealth doesn't protect you from people who operate outside systems that wealth has corrupted. Gu-young's expression remained perfectly neutral, but something cold moved behind his eyes. I'm not concerned about what Williams will do when he discovers who exposed him. I'm more interested in what he'll do when he realizes that everything he built can be dismantled by someone who understands his infrastructure better than he does. Rachel stood as well, pocketing the drives with a decisive motion that suggested she'd made her commitment despite the obvious personal risk. I'll need time to verify everything. If this is legitimate, we're talking about months of work before publication. You have 3 weeks. After that, the window closes and other methods become necessary. Gu-young buttoned his suit jacket with practiced efficiency. Williams has a scheduled appearance at a tech industry conference in San Francisco exactly 23 days from now. Your first story should publish the morning of that appearance. The contrast between his public persona and documented criminal activity will be too cinematically perfect for other media to ignore. You're orchestrating this like a military campaign. I'm orchestrating this like someone who has watched too many powerful people escape accountability because good people believed that institutions would eventually function correctly. Gu-young moved toward the exit, pausing briefly before leaving. Silas Williams buys judges and police to hide his crimes. He stayed in power because people assume that someone else will stop him, that some institution will finally take action. Your story gives those institutions permission to act by making an action more expensive than enforcement. That's not journalism as neutral observer. That's journalism as catalyst for justice that official channels have refused to deliver. He left Rachel sitting alone with 3 encrypted drives and the particular burden that came with possessing information that would either destroy a billionaire or destroy her career. Outside, the K9 lifted its head as Gu-young approached the vehicle, sensing satisfaction in its handler's demeanor. The drives Rachel now possessed represented 18 months of intelligence gathering, bribing insiders, hacking corporate servers, and compiling evidence that prosecutors should have collected years ago if they'd been interested in justice over career preservation. Every document had been verified through multiple sources. Every financial record had been cross-referenced against other databases. Every witness statement had been recorded with sufficient detail to survive legal challenge. The work was professional, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating to anyone who bothered reading it honestly. Gu-young had learned early in his military career that defeating enemies required understanding their defensive positions better than they understood them themselves. Silas Williams had built his empire assuming that wealth was sufficient armor, that legal representation and political connections could neutralize any threat. He'd never planned for someone who didn't want his money, didn't care about social status, and possessed both the technical capability and moral clarity to dismantle his protections systematically. The tax evasion story would damage Williams's reputation among the political class that had protected him. The foreign bribery story would trigger federal investigations that couldn't be easily dismissed. But the organ harvesting story would do something more important. It would transform Silas Williams from a complicated businessman into a monster in the public imagination. And monsters didn't get judicial protection or political cover. Monsters got prosecuted as public examples of system function regardless of their wealth. Gu-young started the vehicle, the K9 settling beside him with the patient readiness of an animal that understood hunting, required both explosive action and extended patience. Rachel Okonkwo would verify the evidence, write her stories with meticulous sourcing, and publish them in outlets that still valued investigative journalism enough to survive the inevitable legal assault. And when those stories detonated in the public consciousness, Silas Williams would discover that all his careful institutional capture had been based on a miscalculation. He'd assumed threats came from regulators, prosecutors, or business competitors. He'd never prepared for threats that emerged from shadows where people like Gu-young built parallel systems of accountability for those the official system protected. The American dream had promised that success came to those who worked hard and played by the rules. Silas Williams had proven that success actually came to those who rewrote rules and purchased rule enforcers. But Gu-young was demonstrating a third principle that rich men always forgot, that every system has vulnerabilities, that every fortress has approaches its builders never imagined, and that justice delayed but delivered with precision was often more devastating than justice delivered immediately. 3 weeks until Silas Williams discovered that the empire he'd built on corruption and human suffering was collapsing not because institutions had suddenly developed integrity, but because someone had decided his time was finished. Gu Young drove through Silver Lake toward Koreatown, his phone already displaying the next phase of the operation, already moving pieces into position for the moment when Williams would try to fight back and discover that his money couldn't buy safety from predators who'd learned to hunt in spaces wealth couldn't reach. Time to pay. The comment sections would say it. The protesters would chant it. The prosecutors would finally pursue it. And Silas Williams would learn what accountability looked like when it arrived from directions he'd never thought to guard. The warehouse sat in an industrial corridor of Riverside, where legitimate businesses had been replaced by operations preferring minimal scrutiny. It was registered to a shell corporation 3 layers removed from Williams Biotech, its address absent from corporate websites. From outside, it resembled a dozen other anonymous structures: corrugated metal walls, minimal windows, a single loading dock for trucks arriving after dark. Gu Young had been watching the facility for 11 days, documenting patterns with the methodical precision that military intelligence training had ingrained into reflex. Shift changes occurred at 2 a.m. and 2 p.m. Security consisted of 4 contractors from a private firm that Williams used for operations requiring plausible deniability. Deliveries happened on Tuesdays and Fridays, refrigerated trucks with medical supply company logos that transported cargo requiring temperature control. The facility ran on a schedule that suggested something more organized than storage, something that demanded regular maintenance and continuous oversight. The intelligence Gu Young had compiled indicated this warehouse functioned as a processing center for the organ harvesting operation, a midpoint between the fake health screening facilities where victims were taken and the underground surgical suite where extractions occurred. Workers were held here for medical evaluation, their tissue types documented, their organs assessed for viability before being moved to the next stage. It was efficient in the way that evil often became when money removed constraints about morality or law. Tonight at 3:17 a.m., that efficiency was about to experience catastrophic disruption. Gu Young stood in darkness 2 blocks away, dressed in unmarked black tactical gear. Around him, 5 veterans prepared with practiced silence. 2 had served in the 707th Special Mission Battalion with Gu Young. 1 was former ROK Navy Special Warfare. 2 others were ex-Korean National Police SWAT who'd left after discovering official authority often protected criminals rather than prosecuting them. The K-9 was present as operational asset, trained for building clearance and threat detection. It sat beside Gu Young, perfectly still, waiting. "Thermal shows 4 heat signatures ground floor, northwest corner," said Alexei Volkov through encrypted radio. Volkov was Russian by birth, Korean by adoption, former signals intelligence. 2 more second floor, likely supervisory. Approximately 12 signatures in the warehouse interior, clustered in containment. 12 victims. 12 people promised medical care and given imprisonment instead. "Guard rotation happens in 8 minutes, Gu Young said, checking the luminous dial on his watch. "We hit the door at 3:20, simultaneous entry front and rear. Volkov, you kill external communications first. I don't want anyone calling for backup that might arrive before we're clear." "Already done," Volkov replied with the satisfaction of someone who'd been 3 steps ahead. "Cell signal jammer is active. Landlines are cut. Their alarm system thinks everything is normal but won't actually transmit if triggered." Gu Young allowed himself a moment of appreciation for competence. Operations succeeded because professionals understood their roles without requiring micromanagement. He'd learned in Korea that the difference between elite units and merely good ones wasn't individual skill, but collective trust, the absolute certainty that when action started, everyone would execute without hesitation or confusion. They moved through darkness like smoke through cracks, 6 men and a dog covering 2 blocks in silence that would have impressed the instructors who'd originally trained them. The warehouse loading dock was secured with a chain that Volkov defeated in 18 seconds. The rear entrance was alarmed, but the alarm had been neutered remotely. The only thing between Gu Young's team and the interior was a steel door and 4 men who believed their position was secure. The door exploded inward with a breaching charge calibrated to destroy the lock, while minimizing noise that might alert distant witnesses. Gu Yong entered first, the K9 beside him, both moving with coordinated precision toward the northwest corner where thermal imaging had identified guards. The first guard had time to register surprise, but not to reach for the weapon holstered at his hip before Gu Yong struck him in the throat with controlled force that collapsed his trachea without killing him. The man went down gasping, functionally neutralized, but alive because Gu Yong needed witnesses who could testify about what they'd seen working for Williams. The second guard managed to draw his weapon, but the K9 was already airborne. 85 pounds of muscle and training hitting him center mass and driving him backward into a wall. The dog's jaws clamped on the guard's gun hand with pressure that forced him to drop the weapon, while teeth punctured flesh without severing arteries. A precisely calibrated application of violence that incapacitated without killing. The remaining two guards on the ground floor attempted coordinated response, but Gu Yong's team had trained for exactly this scenario. Two operators came through the rear entrance simultaneously with the front breach, catching the guards in a crossfire position that left no tactical options except surrender. Both men dropped their weapons and raised their hands with the speed of people who recognized they'd been outmaneuvered by professionals operating at a level their private security training hadn't prepared them for. "Secure them," Gu Yong ordered, already moving toward the stairs leading to the second floor where supervisory personnel were probably reaching for panic buttons that wouldn't function and phones that couldn't connect. The second floor was configured as office space attempting to appear legitimate, desks with computers and filing cabinets that might have belonged to any small business if you ignored the medical equipment visible through the internal window overlooking the warehouse floor. Two men were present, one reaching for a gun in a desk drawer, the other frozen in the particular paralysis that came from recognizing one's own mortality in someone else's eyes. Gu Yong shot the first man in the shoulder with a suppressed pistol, the subsonic round designed to incapacitate rather than kill. The man collapsed screaming, which solved the question of whether the second man would resist. He raised his hands immediately, his face draining of color as Gu Yong approached with the casual confidence of someone who'd conducted room clearances in actual combat, rather than training scenarios. "Face down, hands behind your back," Gu Yong commanded, and the man complied with the desperate speed of someone hoping that obedience might purchase survival. Securing the supervisors took 90 seconds. By the time Gu Yong returned to the ground floor, his team had already moved to the containment area where thermal imaging had identified 12 heat signatures. The door was secured with an electronic lock that Volkov defeated, while two operators covered him with weapons ready for whatever they might find inside. What they found was horror sanitized by fluorescent lighting and medical efficiency. 12 people sat on cots arranged in neat rows, hospital gowns replacing whatever clothing they'd arrived in, IV lines running from their arms to bags hanging from portable stands. They ranged in age from early 20s to mid-40s, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that came from terror sustained over days or weeks. Most were Latino, a few were Asian, one appeared to be Middle Eastern. All of them shared the same expression when Gu Yong's team entered, the desperate hope that rescue had arrived combined with the learned fear that hope often preceded worse suffering. "We're not here to hurt you," Gu Yong said in English, then repeated it in Spanish with the basic fluency that operational necessity had required him to develop. "We're taking you out of here. Medical personnel are waiting outside to check you over and remove those IVs safely. You're going to be okay." One woman, perhaps 30 years old with a scar running along her jawline, spoke in heavily accented English. "They said we were getting health screening, free medical care. They said we needed to stay for observation, but then they locked the doors and took our phones and told us we were being held until testing was complete." Her voice broke on the last words, months of controlled fear finally finding release. "Are we really free?" "You're really free," Gu Yong confirmed, and signaled for two of his operators to begin the careful process of disconnecting IV lines and helping people who'd been sedentary for days to stand and move toward the exit. The extraction took 14 minutes. Each rescued worker carefully guided out the loading dock and into vehicles that would transport them to a medical facility Gu Young controlled. Staffed by doctors who understood that some patients arrived with complicated immigration statuses and trauma that official hospitals would be obligated to report. The 6 guards and supervisors were secured with flex cuffs and left in a position that would be uncomfortable but not dangerous, their weapons and identification collected as evidence. Before leaving, Gu Young took 17 minutes to photograph every document in the second-floor office, download every file from computers that Volkov had already bypassed security on, and collect physical evidence that would connect this facility directly to Williams' biotech corporate structure. Operational planning was worthless if you failed to secure evidence that could survive legal challenge. The warehouse was empty by 4:03 a.m., its prisoners liberated, its guards restrained but alive, its secrets documented and ready for deployment. Gu Young and his team dispersed to separate vehicles, moving through pre-dawn Riverside with the practiced coordination of people who'd rehearsed extraction routes until they became muscle memory. In the back of Gu Young's vehicle, the K9 rested with the satisfied exhaustion of an animal that had fulfilled its purpose. The dog had drawn blood tonight but hadn't killed, had terrified but not mutilated, operating within parameters that allowed violence to remain tool rather than becoming indulgence. By the time the sun rose over Riverside, the warehouse would be discovered by whoever arrived for the morning shift. They'd find guards secured and furious, prisoners vanished, evidence conspicuously absent from locations where it should have been. They'd call their supervisors who would call their supervisors who would eventually inform someone in the Williams corporate hierarchy that an operation that officially didn't exist had been comprehensively breached. And Silas Williams would receive another message written, not in words, but in demonstrated capability. That his empire had vulnerabilities he'd never secured, that his operations could be penetrated and dismantled by people who possessed skills his security contractors had never encountered, that the money he'd spent on protection had purchased an illusion that was dissolving rapidly. Gu Young drove through empty streets toward Koreatown as dawn began painting the sky in shades that suggested new beginnings. 12 people who'd been processed as inventory in a criminal enterprise were now receiving medical care and would eventually receive documentation that might allow them to testify if prosecutors ever developed sufficient courage to charge Silas Williams with crimes his lawyers claimed were impossible to prove. The American system had failed these 12 people, had processed them through a machinery that treated their immigrant status as permission for exploitation. But Gu Young had demonstrated that parallel systems of justice existed for people whom official channels abandoned. Not perfect justice, not clean justice, but justice delivered with precision by people who understood that sometimes protecting the vulnerable required becoming more dangerous than their predators. The raid was complete, the evidence was secured, the next phase could begin. And somewhere in his mansion, insulated by wealth and security theater, Silas Williams was about to learn that money couldn't purchase safety from people who'd spent decades learning to hunt in shadows where his influence couldn't reach. The office building in Koreatown maintained a legitimate facade. Ground floor retail catered to the community, bubble tea, cosmetics, fried chicken. Upper floors housed businesses ranging from accounting to import-export. Gu Young's office occupied the entire 4th floor, accessed by an elevator requiring security clearance and a stairwell monitored by cameras. The office itself projected power through minimalism. A desk of dark wood, chairs for brief conversations, bulletproof windows overlooking the street, Korean landscape art on walls, everything calculated to project competence without vulnerability. Tonight, at 11:47 p.m., the office was dark except for ambient light from the city filtering through those bulletproof windows. Gu Young sat in a chair positioned 15 feet back from his desk, invisible to anyone entering through the main door, his breathing controlled to near silence. The K9 rested at his feet, equally still, trained to remain motionless until commanded otherwise. They'd been waiting for 43 minutes. patience rewarded by the soft mechanical click of someone bypassing the elevator security with equipment sophisticated enough to defeat commercial-grade systems. The elevator doors opened. 4 men emerged, moving with professional coordination. They wore dark clothing, carried suppressed pistols, communicated through hand signals indicating military training. Mercenaries whose backgrounds included special operations before discovering civilian employment offered better compensation. They entered with textbook discipline, the first clearing corners while the second covered, third and fourth establishing overlapping fields of fire. Their movements were fluid, practiced, instinctive. Competent, which meant dangerous, which meant Gu Yong would need to eliminate them with sufficient speed that competence became irrelevant. The lead operator reached Gu Yong's desk, using a small flashlight to illuminate the surface. Empty. No laptop, no papers, nothing that suggested recent occupation. He signaled to his team, a gesture indicating the primary target wasn't present. They began a systematic search of the office, checking the small bathroom, the storage closet, the space behind filing cabinets that might conceal a person attempting to hide. Gu Yong watched from his position in darkness, timing his attack for the moment when their search pattern would leave them maximally exposed. The K9 beside him was coiled tension waiting for release, the animal's prey drive suppressed by training, but ready to explode into violence the instant permission arrived. The lead operator moved past Gu Yong's position, his attention focused on the far corner of the office, where shadows suggested potential concealment. That microsecond of diverted attention was the opening Gu Yong had been waiting for. He moved from the chair with speed that made the transition from stillness to action seem impossible, closing the distance to the operator before the man's peripheral vision could process threat. Gu Yong's first strike targeted the operator's weapon hand, a precise blow to the ulnar nerve that caused involuntary release of the suppressed pistol. His second strike hit the man's throat with controlled force, not enough to kill, but sufficient to collapse the trachea partially and eliminate the operator's ability to call warning. The man went down gasping, and Gu Yong had already pivoted toward the second operator who was turning, trying to acquire a target in darkness, while his brain struggled to process that their ambush had been reversed. The K9 launched simultaneously, 85 pounds of muscle and training hitting the second operator at chest height. The impact drove the man backward into the third operator, both of them tangling as the dog's jaws clamped onto the second operator's forearm with pressure calibrated to break bones without severing the radial artery. The man screamed, a sound that would have been louder if Gu Yong hadn't planned for it. The office walls were soundproofed, acoustic treatment installed ostensibly for privacy, but functioning now to contain evidence of violence occurring within. The fourth operator managed to fire twice, muzzle flash, illuminating the office in strobe light bursts that revealed Gu Yong moving with predatory speed. The suppressed shots hit nothing but wall, subsonic rounds designed for stealth, now just wasted ammunition. Gu Yong closed the distance before the operator could adjust his aim, striking the man's shooting hand with an elbow that shattered metacarpal bones and sent the pistol clattering across the floor. What followed was brutally efficient. Gu Yong had spent years training in Korean military hand-to-hand combat systems that emphasized ending fights quickly through targeted strikes to vulnerable anatomy. He didn't box or grapple. He destroyed structural integrity with techniques designed to incapacitate rather than defeat. A knee to the operator's liver that shut down his diaphragm. An elbow to the temple that induced immediate concussion. The fourth operator collapsed like a marionette with severed strings, conscious but unable to coordinate movement. The third operator had finally extricated himself from his tangle with the second and the K9. He attempted to draw a backup weapon from an ankle holster, but Gu Yong was already inside his reach, controlling the arm before the gun cleared leather. What happened next was not self-defense in any legal sense. It was demonstration. Gu Yong could have simply restrained the man, could have applied a control hold that would immobilize without injury. Instead, he broke the operator's elbow with a precise application of leverage, the joint giving way with an audible crack that drew a scream. "You're done," Gu Yong said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion, just statement of fact. The operator collapsed holding his ruined arm, all fight extinguished by injury and the recognition that he'd been systematically demolished by someone operating at a different level of capability. The entire engagement had lasted 23 seconds from first movement to final takedown. 4 professional operators neutralized without Gu Yong sustaining injury, without the need for lethal force, with efficiency that would have impressed the instructors who'd originally trained him decades ago in Korea. Gu Yong stepped back, breathing only slightly elevated, and gave the K9 a hand signal. The dog released the second operator's mangled forearm and returned to Gu Yong's side, blood on its muzzle but discipline intact. The animal had done precisely what training demanded: attack with overwhelming force, maintain control, disengage on command. The 4 operators were sprawled across his office floor in various states of incapacitation. The first was still struggling to breathe through a partially collapsed trachea. The second was clutching his shattered forearm while trying not to move in ways that would aggravate what were probably multiple fractures. The third was curled around his broken elbow, shock and pain competing for dominance. The fourth was conscious, but concussed, eyes unfocused, and tracking slowly like someone trying to remember where they were. Gu Yong walked to his desk and activated a lamp, flooding the office with light. He studied the operators with clinical detachment. Their weapons were high-end but commercially available. Their tactical gear professional but unmarked. Everything screamed private military contractors hired for what they'd been told would be straightforward. "You were sent by Silas Williams," Gu Yong said, statement of fact. "You were told I'm a gangster who needed elimination. You were paid well." The lead operator produced a wheezing sound through his collapsed trachea. "Here's what happens," Gu Yong continued, calm and conversational. "I'm calling medical personnel who will treat your injuries without questions. You'll be transported to a private clinic. Then you'll leave Los Angeles and never return." He paused. "The alternative is different people who dispose of bodies. Silas Williams hired you because you're deniable. That cuts both ways. He won't report your disappearance." The fourth operator managed to focus. "We're just doing a job." "You accepted money to kill someone you'd never met. That's not a job. That's being a mercenary without conviction." Gu Yong's voice hardened with contempt. "You fight for a paycheck. I fight for principle. That's why you're on my floor." He made a call in Korean. Medical personnel would arrive in 12 minutes. The K9 sat beside Gu Yong, alert but calm, having performed its function and received acknowledgement. The dog understood what these men didn't. That violence was tool rather than purpose. That controlled aggression served principles that mere paycheck motivation could never match. Gu Yong walked to the window and looked out over Koreatown, the neighborhood he'd built power within by being more competent, more disciplined, and more committed than people who operated from positions of inherited advantage. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Silas Williams was probably receiving news that his assassination attempt had failed, that the 4 professionals he'd hired had been neutralized so completely that they wouldn't even be useful as witnesses against Gu Yong, because acknowledging the failed hit would require admitting he'd ordered it. This had been demonstration, not defense. Gu Yong could have avoided these operators entirely, could have been elsewhere when they arrived, could have let them discover an empty office and report failure without engagement. Instead, he'd chosen to be present, chosen to dismantle them personally, chosen to send a message written in broken bones and humiliation. That Silas Williams's money couldn't purchase safety from someone who'd spent decades becoming more dangerous than any contractor wealth could hire. The elevator doors opened again 14 minutes later, and medical personnel entered with practiced efficiency, asking no questions, making no judgments, just providing care to injured men who'd learned an expensive lesson about the difference between professionals who worked for principle versus professionals who worked for pay. By the time they departed, Gu Yong's office showed no evidence of violence. Blood cleaned, floor polished, brass casings collected, everything restored to minimalist elegance. Gu Yong sat at his desk reviewing next operations. The assassination attempt had been expected, even welcome. It demonstrated Silas Williams feeling pressure, reacting defensively, making mistakes. The K9 rested at his feet, violence completed and compartmentalized. Somewhere in the city, 4 mercenaries were learning that contracts from wealthy sociopaths carried inadequately compensated risks. Gu Young had learned that wealth and connections mattered more than integrity. But he'd also learned that tactical superiority combined with moral clarity could defeat advantages money purchased. Silas Williams hired mercenaries. Gu Young had become something more dangerous, a man who fought for principle against people who fought for profit. The man in the charcoal suit had demonstrated what happened when privilege encountered competence, married to conviction. He closed his laptop and stood, the K9 rising beside him. Tomorrow would bring new moves. Tonight had been demonstration that when violence became necessary, Gu Young delivered it with efficiency that professional killers found educational. He departed, leaving behind an office giving no indication of what had transpired. Just another night in Koreatown. Just another businessman working late. Just another reminder that the most dangerous people often looked ordinary until circumstances demanded revelation. Jake Williams had convinced himself the worst was over. His accounts remained frozen. His social media toxic with leaked evidence, his father's attorneys managing an expanding crisis. But he was alive, unharmed, still in his penthouse despite the Korean coin incident. He'd hired new bodyguards, former Secret Service agents promising real protection. He'd stopped posting online, stopped doing anything that might draw attention. Tonight was supposed to be tentative normalcy. The nightclub was exclusive, members only, with security protocols protecting valuable clientele. Jake arrived with 2 bodyguards who'd cleared the venue, positioned themselves strategically, maintained contact with a driver outside. Everything by the textbook. The club was loud, crowded, exclusive. Jake took a VIP table, ordered expensive bottles, tried recapturing invulnerability. At 1:33 a.m., the power died. Total blackout. Music died mid-beat. 300 people plunged into darkness broken only by emergency lighting after a 3-second delay. Confusion transformed into nervous laughter and phone flashlights. Jake's bodyguards converged immediately. "Stay down," the larger one commanded, "moving you out through rear exit." They formed protective triangle, moving through the crowd with aggressive efficiency. The rear exit corridor was empty under red emergency lighting. 20 feet from the exit, the lead bodyguard stopped, hand reaching for his weapon. He collapsed, dart in his neck, sedative dropping him instantly. The second bodyguard spun and took 2 darts to the chest. 3 stumbling steps before his legs gave out. Jake tried running, expensive shoes slipping on concrete. 5 steps before something hit him from behind, driving him into a wall. Hands grabbed him, multiple sets, military coordination. Chemical-soaked cloth pressed against his face. His last conscious thought was that the Korean coin had been warning rather than threat. Consciousness returned gradually, sensory information arriving in fragments that Jake's brain struggled to assemble into coherent understanding. Cold concrete beneath him. Zip ties binding his wrists behind his back. The particular silence that came from being somewhere without ambient noise. No traffic sounds or ventilation, hum, or evidence of proximity to urban activity. He opened his eyes to fluorescent lighting that seemed harsh after darkness, blinking until vision resolved into clarity. The room was perhaps 15 feet square, concrete walls and floor without windows or visible doors, the kind of space designed to be secure rather than comfortable. A metal chair sat bolted to the floor in the center of the room. Against one wall, a table held items Jake couldn't quite identify from his current position on the floor. The air tasted recycled, stale, like breathing inside a sealed container. Jake struggled to sitting position, his shoulders screaming protest at the angle his bound wrists forced them into. "Hello!" His voice came out hoarse, whether from the sedative or fear he couldn't determine. "Where am I? Who's there?" A section of wall Jake had assumed was solid concrete proved to be a door. opening without sound to reveal the man who'd been sitting in the corner booth when Jake's world had begun collapsing. The Korean in the charcoal suit, looking exactly as composed and dangerous as he had in the bistro, moving with the same predatory economy that suggested violence held in reserve rather than threatened. Behind him, the massive K9 entered, and Jake's bladder clenched with terror so primal it bypassed rational thought. The dog was terrifying in the way that apex predators were terrifying, all muscle and focused attention, eyes locked on Jake with intensity that communicated he was prey being evaluated for vulnerability. "My name is Gu Young," the man said, his voice carrying none of the theatrical menace Jake had heard in movies featuring villains who monologued. This was conversational, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more frightening. "You're in a facility that doesn't appear on any map, owned through a corporate structure that can't be traced to me, located somewhere your father's investigators won't find regardless of how much money he spends searching. You're here because we need to have a conversation about choices." "This is kidnapping," Jake managed, his voice breaking on the last syllable. "You can't just, 'my father will.' Your father is currently dealing with federal investigators examining his tax returns, journalists publishing evidence of foreign bribery, and prosecutors preparing charges related to human trafficking and organ harvesting. He's somewhat preoccupied." Gu Young moved to the chair and sat, crossing his legs with casual precision. "Your bodyguards are unharmed. They'll wake up confused but intact. The nightclub will review security footage and find that the camera system experienced malfunction during the exact window when you disappeared. This is professional work, Jake. The kind your father's money can't defend against because it operates in spaces where money's influence doesn't reach." Jake's mind was racing, trying to find leverage, trying to remember anything from action movies or crime shows that might apply to actual kidnapping by someone who clearly possessed skills beyond anything his imagination had prepared him for. "What do you want? Money?" "I can." "I don't want your money. I want information, cooperation, and then I want you to make a choice that will determine whether you live the rest of your life in poverty or whether you die tonight, and your body is discovered in circumstances that make your father's legal problems significantly worse." Gu Young's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held the same cold calculation Jake had seen in the bistro. "Let me explain what you're going to do. You're going to provide me with passwords to your father's personal servers, access codes to his offshore accounts, and detailed information about Williams' biotech operations that you've been involved in or overheard discussed. Then you're going to sign a confession detailing your father's crimes and your own participation in covering them up." "I don't know anything about my father's business." Jake was crying now, tears streaming down his face without shame or restraint, the last remnants of his privileged composure dissolving under stress he'd never been forced to endure. "I'm not involved in operations. I'm his son. I don't work for the companies." "You're his son who's lived in luxury, funded by criminal enterprises. You're his son who's committed assaults that your father's money covered up. You're his son who posted videos humiliating service workers while knowing your father's lawyers would prevent consequences." Gu Young leaned forward slightly. "You've spent 29 years benefiting from your father's crimes. Tonight, you're going to help dismantle the infrastructure that made those crimes possible." The K9 moved closer to Jake, close enough that he could feel the dog's breath, warm and carrying the scent of something carnivorous. Jake tried to push himself backward, but his bound wrists prevented meaningful movement. Please, I'll tell you whatever you want. Just keep that thing away from me." The dog is trained to detect deception through physiological responses humans can't control. If you lie to me, he'll indicate it, and I'll know to ask the question differently until I get truth. Gu Young stood and walked to the table against the wall, returning with a laptop and what appeared to be a digital recorder. "We're going to start with simple questions. Where does your father keep physical records of offshore transactions?" Jake talked. For 3 hours, he talked, providing every piece of information he could recall about his father's operations, every conversation he'd overheard, every detail about corporate structures and shell companies and properties that existed off official books. Gu Young took notes with meticulous precision, occasionally pausing to verify details through searches on the laptop, comparing Jake's statements against databases he'd apparently compiled during months of investigation. The dog never indicated deception, probably because Jake was too terrified to attempt lying, too aware that his survival depended on cooperation, too broken by circumstances to maintain the entitled defiance that had defined his previous existence. When the interrogation finally concluded, Gu Young placed a document in front of Jake. 10 pages of detailed confession, admitting to knowledge of his father's crimes, acknowledging his own assaults, accepting responsibility for actions that wealth had previously insulated from consequences. Sign this. It will be held in escrow and released if your father attempts retaliation against anyone involved in exposing his operations. Jake signed without reading, his hand trembling so badly the signature was barely recognizable. Now comes your choice, Gu Young said, standing. You can remain loyal to your father, refuse to testify against him, and in approximately 6 hours your body will be discovered in a location that makes investigators wonder whether your father had you killed to prevent cooperation. Or you can testify truthfully, provide evidence prosecutors can use, and live the rest of your life under witness protection with a new identity and income that will feel like poverty compared to what you're accustomed to but will keep you breathing. What kind of choice is that? Jake's voice was hoarse from hours of talking. It's the choice between accepting responsibility and escaping it through death. Your father has spent decades choosing the latter. You get to choose differently. Gu Young moved toward the door. You have 12 hours to decide. Food and water will be provided. The room is monitored. If you attempt self-harm, medical personnel will intervene. Think carefully about whether dying rich is preferable to living poor, because those are your only options now. The door closed, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and terror, and the gradual recognition that everything he'd believed about his own safety had been comfortable delusion. His father's money hadn't protected him. His bodyguards hadn't protected him. Nothing protected people like him from people like Gu Young except being worth more alive than dead, and Jake was finally understanding that his value had always been provisional. Outside the secure room, Gu Young reviewed the recorded confession, satisfied that Jake had provided sufficient detail to corroborate evidence already compiled. The young man would break completely within hours, would choose survival over loyalty, would testify against his father with the desperate enthusiasm of someone trying to purchase clemency through betrayal. It wasn't justice in any clean sense, but it was accountability arriving for people who'd spent lifetimes avoiding it, delivered by someone who'd learned that official systems only functioned when pressure made their dysfunction more expensive than their function. Jake Williams would live or die based on decisions made in the next 12 hours. Either outcome served Gu Young's purposes. Either outcome represented consequence finding privilege that had believed itself immune. The American dream promised that hard work yielded success. The reality was that wealth purchased immunity until someone with equivalent skills but different motivation decided that immunity had expired. And tonight, in an underground facility that didn't exist on any map, Jake Williams was discovering what accountability felt like when it arrived from shadows his father's money couldn't illuminate. The 12 hours crawled past with time distortion that came from confinement without natural light. Jake sat on concrete, wrists freed but marked with red impressions, trying to process the choice as though analysis could reveal a third option. Betray his father and live, remain loyal and die. The confession lay across the room, 10 pages documenting Silas Williams's criminal empire. Jake had read it twice, first seeking inaccuracies, then with growing recognition that everything was true. His father had built wealth through organ harvesting, human trafficking, foreign bribes, tax evasion. His father made people disappear. Jake had known pieces throughout his life, fragments overheard, glimpses of documents, behavioral patterns. But he'd never assembled complete understanding, never forced himself to acknowledge what wealth bought beyond comfort. He'd maintained willful ignorance because accepting truth would have required questioning whether he deserved this life. Now he confronted what he'd avoided for 29 years. His existence had been subsidized by human suffering. The bistro incident hadn't been isolated cruelty. It perfectly represented his family's operation. Other people were instruments to use or obstacles to remove, never humans deserving consideration. The door opened and Gu Young entered carrying Korean food, rice, kimchi, grilled meat, soup. The K9 followed, settling watchfully near the door. "You should eat," Gu Young said, placing the tray beside Jake's confession. "The choice you need to make deserves clear thinking." Jake stared at the food. "How am I supposed to choose between destroying my father and killing myself?" "It's choosing between accepting consequences or becoming another casualty." Gu Young sat, relaxed but alert. "Your father has made this calculation hundreds of times. He's always chosen self-preservation. You're his son. This is genetic." "He's still my father." The words came out defensive, reflexive, the last gasp of family loyalty that had been Jake's only consistent principle. "Whatever he's done, he's my father." "Your father has spent your entire life using you as convenient prop for his respectable businessman performance. He funded your lifestyle not out of love, but because having a visible son reinforced his public image as family man rather than criminal enterprise operator. When you assaulted women, he covered it up not to protect you, but to protect his reputation. When you posted videos humiliating service workers, he didn't correct your behavior because it mirrored his own contempt for people he considered beneath consideration. Gu Young's voice remained neutral, clinical, delivering diagnosis rather than accusation. "He's your father in biological sense, but he's never acted as though you were his son in any meaningful way." Jake wanted to argue, but couldn't find words that would contradict what he'd observed throughout his life. His father had never attended his school events unless they involved wealthy families worth networking with. His father had never asked about his interests or aspirations beyond which university might provide best social connections. His father had provided money but never presence, funding but never engagement, resources but never relationship. "The prosecutors building cases against your father have testimonies from 14 families whose relatives disappeared after working at Williams' facilities," Gu Young continued. "They have financial records showing $2.3 billion in offshore counts funding bribes and tax evasion. They have evidence of organ harvesting operations that have processed at least 47 victims. But they lack the insider testimony that would make prosecution inevitable rather than difficult. Your confession provides that testimony. Your cooperation would ensure that your father faces accountability regardless of how many lawyers he hires or judges he's cultivated relationships with." "And if I cooperate, what happens to me?" Jake's voice was small, the voice of someone who'd already accepted defeat but still hoped to negotiate the terms. "Witness protection, new identity, employment around 40,000 yearly, supervised restrictions on travel and communication. Handlers ensure you follow protocols." Gu Young paused. "Not imprisonment, not freedom either. You'll spend life looking over your shoulder, wondering whether strangers recognize you, whether your father's associates found you." "That sounds like dying slowly." "It's living with consequences. Most people call that normal existence." Gu Young picked up Jake's confession. "Your father built an empire on immunity through money, but money can't buy protection from people operating outside those systems. I'm proof. You're proof his immunity was conditional. Those conditions changed." Jake finally moved toward the food, not because he was hungry, but because doing something physical felt better than sitting paralyzed by impossible choice. He ate mechanically, the flavors barely registering through anxiety that had his stomach clenched too tight for normal digestion. "How do I know you'll actually let me live if I cooperate? How do I know this isn't just manipulation to get testimony before you kill me anyway?" "You don't. You have no leverage, no guarantees, no ability to verify promises I make. You're entirely dependent on my integrity, which must be terrifying for someone who's never had to trust anyone who wasn't financially incentivized to maintain your well-being." Gu Young's expression suggested something that might have been sympathy if it wasn't quite so clinical. "But consider the alternative. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I had access to your penthouse bedroom while you slept. I had an opportunity during your abduction when your consciousness was chemically compromised. I have an opportunity now in a facility designed to prevent escape and contain evidence. The fact that you're alive suggests I value your testimony more than your death. That's as close to guarantee as your situation permits." Jake finished eating in silence, trying to find some angle, some perspective that would make this choice less impossible. His entire life had been about avoiding consequences through his father's money and influence. Every assault covered up, every scandal managed, every problem resolved through resources that make accountability optional. Now he was being told that survival required accepting everything his father had taught him to avoid: poverty, vulnerability, dependence on institutions rather than wealth. "What happens to my father?" Jake asked finally. "If I testify, what exactly happens?" "Federal prosecutors will indict him on multiple charges. Tax evasion carries a potential 20-year sentence. Foreign bribery violations carry similar penalties. Human trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder carry life sentences without parole possibility. He'll be arrested publicly, probably at his office where the media can capture footage that will dominate news cycles for weeks. His assets will be frozen pending criminal forfeiture proceedings. His attorneys will mount sophisticated defense, attempting to exclude evidence and discredit witnesses. But your testimony, combined with documentation I've provided to journalists and investigators, makes conviction nearly certain. He'll die in prison. Yes, your father is 64 years old. Even if he receives concurrent sentences totaling 30 years, he'll die incarcerated. His wealth will be seized. His reputation will be destroyed. His business empire will be dismantled and sold to satisfy judgments from families whose lives he damaged. Everything he built will be erased, and his name will be remembered as a cautionary tale about criminal excess rather than business success." Gu Young returned to his chair. "That's what your testimony purchases. Not just your survival, but his complete annihilation. So the question isn't whether you value your father's freedom over your own life. The question is whether you value his life's work enough to die protecting it, knowing that your death won't actually protect it, but will simply add another casualty to his legacy." Jake put his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been suppressing throughout this nightmare. 29 years of privilege was ending with a choice between betraying the man who'd funded that privilege or dying to maintain loyalty that had never been reciprocated. His father had covered up Jake's assaults to protect reputation rather than son. His father had provided resources to maintain a useful prop rather than a beloved child. His father had built an empire on human suffering, while teaching Jake that other people's pain was irrelevant to their family's success. "I'll testify," Jake said finally, the words coming out broken by crying that had probably been building for years without outlet. "I'll give them everything I know. I'll cooperate completely. I'll do whatever keeps me breathing, even if that breathing happens in some shitty apartment in some nowhere city where I'm working retail for minimum wage." That's survival instinct overcoming learned loyalty. It's the first honest choice you've probably made in your entire life. Gu Young stood. "Federal prosecutors will arrive within the hour to take your statement. They'll transport you to a secure facility where witness protection protocols begin immediately. You'll likely never see Lowe's angels again. You'll certainly never see your father except possibly through courtroom glass if you're required to testify in person. Your old life ends tonight. What replaces it won't be comfortable, but it will be yours in ways that nothing funded by your father's money ever was. Will I ever feel safe again? No, safety is an illusion that wealthy people maintain by insulating themselves from reality. You're going to live in reality now, where safety is provisional, and consequences are permanent and choices matter because you can't buy your way out of them." Gu Young moved toward the door, the K9 rising to follow. "Welcome to how most people live, Jake. It's terrifying and uncertain and requires constant vigilance, but it's authentic in ways your previous existence never was." The door closed, leaving Jake alone with his confession and his choice and his future that would consist of looking over his shoulder while working jobs that his previous self would have considered beneath consideration. He'd chosen survival over loyalty, fear over pride, poverty over death. In making that choice, he'd finally accepted responsibility for participating in family enterprise built on human suffering. Somewhere in Lowe's Angels, Silas Williams was probably conducting business, as usual, confident that his money would protect him from consequences that were finally arriving. He didn't know yet that his son had broken, had chosen self-preservation over family loyalty, had provided testimony that would ensure his empire collapsed completely. The American dream had promised that hard work yielded success. Silas Williams had proven that crime combined with wealth yielded immunity. But Jake Williams was discovering a third principle, that immunity was always temporary, that consequences eventually arrived regardless of wealth, and that survival sometimes required betraying everything you'd been taught to value. Gu Young watched through monitors as federal prosecutors entered the secure facility to take Jake Williams into custody. The young man would spend the rest of his life in relative poverty, always wondering whether that stranger on the street recognized him, whether his father's associates had finally located him, whether survival had been worth the cost of betrayal. But he would be alive, and his testimony would ensure that Silas Williams experienced consequences that wealth had convinced him would never arrive. That wasn't perfect justice, but it was accountability delivered with precision to people who'd spent lifetimes avoiding it. The K-9 rested beside Gu Young's chair, mission accomplished, understanding that the hunt was moving into its final phase. Tomorrow would bring arrests and media coverage and the spectacular collapse of an empire built on human suffering. Tonight had simply been the moment when the empire's heir chose survival over loyalty and unknowingly ensured that his father's immunity expired permanently. Jake Williams had made his choice. Now Silas Williams would face consequences that decades of wealth had convinced him were impossible. And Gu Young would watch from shadows as the American legal system finally functioned correctly, not because institutions had developed integrity, but because someone had made their dysfunction more expensive than their function. The weight of consequence had finally found people who'd spent lifetimes avoiding it. And in an underground facility that didn't exist on any map, Jake Williams was learning that survival sometimes required becoming the person your father taught you to despise. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles had witnessed countless perp walks over its 70-year history, but the crowds gathering along Spring Street at 9:47 a.m. suggested this one would be different. News vans lined both sides of the block, satellite dishes extended toward gray morning sky, reporters practicing sound bites while camera operators jockeyed for optimal angles. Behind police barricades, protesters held signs with messages ranging from demands for justice to accusations of corruption. Some carried photographs of missing relatives who'd worked at Williams' facilities. Others simply stood in silence, bearing witness to a moment that felt less like standard legal proceedings and more like the collapse of an entire system of impunity. Inside the courthouse, Silas Williams sat in a holding cell designed for temporary detention of defendants awaiting arraignment. He wore a custom suit that probably cost more than the annual salary of the public defenders who worked 3 floors above him. But the suit couldn't disguise what the past 72 hours had done to his appearance. His face showed the particular exhaustion that came from discovering that wealth couldn't purchase solutions to certain problems. His eyes carried the hollow recognition that the machinery he'd spent decades building and maintaining had turned against him with mechanical efficiency. The charges filed by federal prosecutors read like a catalog of institutional failure, 37 counts spanning tax evasion, foreign bribery violations, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, accessory to murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Each count represented years of criminal activity that had been documented, investigated, and then mysteriously abandoned by prosecutors who decided that pursuing a billionaire was professionally inadvisable. But the documentation Rachel Okonkwo had published in a series of devastating articles over the past week had made abandonment impossible. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well-sourced, too damning to dismiss as conspiracy theory or business competitor sabotage. The Los Angeles Times had run the tax evasion story first, methodically detailing how Williams had moved $2.3 billion through offshore structures specifically designed to avoid federal taxation. The story included actual tax documents, communications between Williams and his accountants discussing evasion strategies, and expert analysis explaining how the schemes violated multiple provisions of federal tax law. Other media outlets had picked up the story within hours, and by the second day, senators were demanding investigations, and the IRS was announcing a comprehensive audit of all Williams corporate entities. The foreign bribery story had followed 3 days later, building on the tax evasion foundation, by demonstrating that the offshore structures weren't just tax avoidance, but mechanisms for paying bribes to government officials in 7 countries. Rachel had named names, provided dollar amounts, included communications showing Silas Williams personally authorizing payments that violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The State Department had issued carefully worded statements acknowledging awareness of the allegations and promising cooperation with any investigations. But the third story had been the one that transformed Silas Williams from complicated businessman into monster requiring immediate prosecution. The organ harvesting operation, documented with facility locations, financial ledgers, victim testimonies, and communications showing direct involvement by Williams in operational decisions. Rachel had published photographs of the Riverside warehouse after Gu Yong's raid, interviewed 3 of the rescued workers who'd agreed to speak publicly despite immigration concerns, and included expert analysis from medical ethicists explaining exactly how the operation had functioned and why it represented one of the most systematic violations of human dignity in recent American history. The public reaction had been immediate and overwhelming. Protests outside Williams' corporate headquarters, calls for boycotts of any business associated with the Williams name, demands that prosecutors who'd previously declined to investigate be held accountable for their inaction. The machinery that had protected Silas Williams for decades had disintegrated in less than a week, not because institutions had suddenly developed integrity, but because the cost of protecting him had become greater than the cost of prosecuting him. Federal marshals arrived at the holding cell to transport Silas Williams to the courtroom for his arraignment. They processed him with professional detachment, neither sympathetic to his fall nor celebratory about his capture, just executing their function within a system that was finally operating as designed. Williams walked through corridors flanked by marshals, his expensive shoes clicking against linoleum floors that had been walked by thousands of defendants who discovered that American justice was indifferent to their previous status once prosecution commenced. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, every seat filled with journalists, victims' family members, legal observers, and citizens who'd taken the morning off work to witness this particular moment of accountability. The gallery erupted in muted reaction when Williams entered. No cheering because the judge wouldn't permit it, but a collective exhale that suggested people had been holding their breath waiting for confirmation that this was actually happening. The arraignment proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. The prosecutor, a career federal attorney who'd built her reputation on complex white-collar cases, read the charges in a voice that conveyed neither triumph nor vindictiveness, just steady presentation of facts that spoke for themselves. Williams's attorney, one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers on the West Coast, entered a plea of not guilty and requested bail with conditions that would allow his client to remain free pending trial. The prosecutor objected, citing flight risk, given Williams's significant financial resources and connections in countries without extradition treaties. The judge, a woman in her early 60s who'd been appointed to the federal bench after spending 20 years as a prosecutor, listened to both arguments with an expression that suggested she'd already made her decision before the hearing started. She denied bail, citing the severity of the charges, the strength of the evidence presented in the prosecutor's filing, and the very real concern that a man with Williams's resources could disappear before trial if given the opportunity. Silas Williams would remain in federal detention pending trial, his assets frozen pending criminal forfeiture proceedings, his empire effectively dismantled before he'd even been convicted. The courtroom erupted again as Williams was led away in handcuffs, this time with sounds that the judge didn't immediately silence. The cathartic release of people who'd watched powerful men escape accountability for so long, that they'd stopped believing justice was possible. Williams didn't look back at the gallery as he was escorted out. His face showed the particular defeat that came from understanding that everything he'd built was being stripped away with the same systematic efficiency he'd once used to destroy others. Outside the courthouse, Rachel Okonkwo stood among the media scrum, fielding questions about her investigation and the sources who'd provided the evidence. She was careful, practiced, revealing nothing that would compromise her journalistic integrity while making clear that the documentation spoke for itself. When asked whether she believed Williams would be convicted, she simply said that prosecutors had evidence sufficient to prove their case beyond reasonable doubt, and that the American legal system was finally functioning as it should. 3 miles away, in the industrial corridor of Riverside, where the organ harvesting warehouse had operated, a different kind of transformation was occurring. The facility that had been used to process human beings like inventory was being converted into something that represented the opposite of its previous function. Workers were removing medical equipment that had been installed for exploitation and replacing it with counseling offices, legal aid workstations, and community gathering spaces. The building was becoming a survivor resource center, a place where immigrants could access services without fear, where people whose lives had been damaged by Williams' operations could receive support in rebuilding. Montessa Daniels stood in what had been the containment area where her sister Kendra had likely been held before disappearing. The space was being transformed into a memorial garden, names of victims etched into stone markers, surrounded by plants that required tending and care. Kendra's name was there, along with 13 others whose families had never received closure, whose disappearances had been processed as statistics rather than tragedies. Montessa placed her hand on her sister's marker, and for the first time since learning the truth about what had happened, she felt something approaching peace. Not justice in any pure sense. Kendra was still gone, that loss permanent and irreversible. But accountability had arrived for the people responsible, and the space where her sister had suffered was being reclaimed for purposes that honored rather than exploited human dignity. The burns on Montessa's chest and shoulders had healed to the point where physical therapy was showing real progress. The scarring would be permanent, a reminder written on her skin about the day her life had intersected with people who viewed her as disposable. But Gu Young had ensured she had resources to manage the medical costs, had provided housing and income while she recovered, had demonstrated that protection meant more than just preventing harm. It meant ensuring people could rebuild after harm had occurred. She turned from the memorial markers to find Gu Young standing near the entrance to the garden, the K9 beside him as always, both of them maintaining the watchful presence that had become familiar over the past weeks. He approached with the same measured precision that characterized all his movements, neither hurried nor hesitant, just purposeful. "The center will be operational within 30 days, Gu Young said, his tone conversational despite the weight of what they were discussing. "It will provide legal assistance, medical care, job placement, and counseling for anyone affected by Williams' operations or similar exploitation. The funding comes from assets seized during the criminal investigation, which seems appropriate." "My sister would have liked that," Montessa replied, her voice steady despite the emotions the conversation evoked. "She always wanted to help people. She went into laboratory work because she thought medical research would make a difference. Instead, she discovered that the company she worked for was murdering people and got killed for trying to do the right thing. She did do the right thing. She reported what she found. That information, combined with evidence from other sources, is what made prosecution possible." Gu Young paused, choosing his next words with care. "Nothing returns what was taken from you, but the people responsible are facing consequences they spent lifetimes avoiding, and the systems that protected them are being dismantled. That's as close to justice as situations like this permit." Montessa nodded, understanding that Gu Young was offering truth rather than comfort, reality rather than reassurance. "What happens to you now? Do you just disappear back into whatever shadows you came from?" "I continue doing what I've always done, protecting people the official system ignores, building power in spaces where institutional authority refuses to operate effectively, ensuring that when justice doesn't arrive through conventional channels, it arrives through other means. He looked out over the memorial garden, his expression revealing nothing but his eyes suggesting something that might have been satisfaction. The Williams empire is dismantled. But there are always other predators, other people who believe wealth purchases immunity, other systems that need correction when they fail people they're supposed to protect. You're not going to stop, are you? Even with Williams in custody, even with the media attention and the investigations, you're just going to keep operating outside the law. I operate in the spaces where the law deliberately fails to reach. That's different from operating outside it. Gu-young turned to face her directly. The American legal system is functioning correctly right now because someone made its dysfunction more expensive than its function. Without that external pressure, Silas Williams would still be free, still operating his criminal enterprises, still destroying lives. The system didn't suddenly develop integrity. It was forced to operate correctly by people willing to use methods the system itself would never employ. Montesa studied him, this man who'd rescued her sister's memory from official erasure, who dismantled a billionaire's empire with tactical precision, who spoke about violence and justice with the same clinical detachment. Are you a good person, Gu-young? Or are you just someone who happens to be targeting people I want destroyed? I'm someone who learned that the American dream was a lie designed to keep people compliant while systems exploited them. I'm someone who built parallel institutions when official ones failed. I'm someone who delivers accountability when conventional justice proves insufficient. He gestured toward the memorial garden. Whether that makes me good or simply useful is a question for philosophers. I'm focused on outcomes rather than moral categorization. The K9 shifted beside him, attentive but relaxed, and Montesa found herself thinking about what it meant that this dangerous man's closest companion was an animal trained for protection rather than pure aggression. There was something almost poetic about it. The predator who hunted predators, the criminal who delivered justice, the man who operated in shadows to defend people living in light. Thank you, Montesa said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. For my sister, for me, for all of this. She gestured at the garden and the building being transformed around them. I don't understand everything you do or why you do it, but I understand that without you, none of this justice would have happened. Gu-young nodded once, acknowledgement without need for elaboration. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, the K9 following with the same fluid precision, both of them moving like smoke through space, present, and then absent in ways that made witnesses question whether they'd actually been there at all. Montesa watched him go, this man who'd entered her life during her worst moment and systematically dismantled the empire that had caused it. She'd probably never see him again, would probably read about his operations only when they intersected with public consciousness in ways that forced media attention. But she'd remember him as proof that power existed outside official channels, that justice could arrive from unexpected directions, that the quietest person in the room was often the most dangerous to those who deserved danger. Across the city, in the same upscale bistro where this entire cascade of consequences had been initiated by a cup of scalding coffee, Gu-young settled into his corner booth with an Americano and his tablet displaying news coverage of the Williams arraignment. The K9 rested at his feet, alert but patient, understanding that their work was complete for now, but never truly finished. The bistro staff recognized him. The well-dressed Korean man who'd been present the day Montesa Daniels was assaulted, who'd sat quietly in his corner booth watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. They served him with respectful efficiency, understanding without being told that this was someone who deserved their best attention without requiring their conversation. Gu-young reviewed the news coverage with satisfaction that came from seeing plans executed with precision. Silas Williams in custody, Jake Williams in witness protection, his testimony ensuring his father's conviction would be inevitable. The organ harvesting operation dismantled, and its victims received support. The journalists who'd enabled the exposure received recognition for investigative work that would probably earn awards. The prosecutors who'd finally done their jobs being celebrated as champions of justice, rather than criticized for their previous inaction. It was as close to perfect as outcomes involving human suffering could ever be. Not clean, not simple, not without costs that would never fully be repaid. But accountability had arrived for people who'd spent lifetimes avoiding it, delivered by someone who'd learned to operate in spaces where official authority feared to tread. His phone vibrated with a message from one of his network contacts. Another situation developing in San Francisco. Another person with too much money and too little accountability. Another opportunity to demonstrate that privilege was always provisional, that systems could be corrected when their dysfunction became too expensive to ignore, that justice delayed but delivered with precision was often more devastating than justice delivered immediately. Gu Yung finished his coffee and stood, the K9 rising beside him with the readiness that came from understanding their work was never truly complete. They departed the bistro through the front entrance, the man in the charcoal suit and his companion moving through Los Angeles streets with the casual confidence of people who belonged in every space they chose to occupy. Behind them, the city continued its complicated existence, full of people trying to survive systems designed to exploit them, full of predators convinced their wealth purchased immunity, full of opportunities for someone who understood that real power came not from institutions, but from the willingness to operate where institutions deliberately failed. The balance had been restored. The consequences had been delivered. The American dream's ugly truth had been exposed and corrected, at least in this instance, at least for now. And in a corner booth of an upscale bistro, the seat remained warm where the quietest person in the room had been watching, waiting, calculating the precise moment when silence would transform into action and privilege would finally meet its reckoning. Jake Williams learned the hard way that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. Would you have shown Jake any mercy? Let us know in the comments.